Well, good morning. I need to make an announcement, I guess, first thing, just to get this out of the way. I was told just a second ago that Ray and Carol Robertson are here, and today is their 71st wedding anniversary. So we wanted to say congratulations for that. I don't know where they're at. They're usually right in here somewhere, but I'll be praying for. Say something to them afterward. We're in the middle of a series, second week. We're going through Colossians, and what we're trying to do through the book of Colossians is look at what Paul had to say about following Jesus and how Paul kind of directed us to live our lives in a way that was worthy of that gospel. And that was last week's sermon, live your life worthy of the gospel of Christ. This week, we're going to look at verses 15 through 23, where he's kind of amplifying that thought. He's kind of taking that little bit of a thought and making it bigger and trying to explain it more. So we're going to focus on that today. And Paul's going to seem to say, through the different things that he describes, that Jesus is kind of the center of everything. Now, and not just in a... in church we would say Jesus is the center of everything. You've got a cross on the wall, but it's more than he's saying more than that. He's saying that creation itself was made by Jesus, and it's empowered by Jesus today. It's going to end in Jesus, and he's the point of everything. Saved, unsaved, secular, spiritual, it's all finds its root in Jesus, and that's a little further than most people would say. Now, sometimes we would write songs that kind of hint at that kind of thinking as Christians. He's got the whole world in his hands, or you're the very air I breathe, and those kind of things. But to take a whole section of Scripture and try to make that point, that's a little unusual, but it's important. And I think it's important for us to kind of have that grasp of Jesus, or at least see a little bit of it the same way Paul does. I think he's trying to explain something pretty important here, and we need to kind of have that in the back of our head. It led me down a rabbit trail thinking about that. I'm online, and I'm trying to think about, somehow I got from Jesus is everything to a theory of everything, and then that led me down this whole physics rabbit trail. How many of you love physics? Okay, all right. Well, there's a few smart people, and you'll be the ones who'll come to me after the service and say that I got part of this next part wrong. So I know that ahead of time before I get into this thing. But I'm reading about this theory of everything, the philosophy here, the notion that the world that we live in, the universe that we're part of, is intricately structured. And it ought to be possible to have one unifying theory that explains all of it. Why the planets move the way they do, why energy and matter and mass, why it all works like it works. There ought to be some theory out there that can make sense of all that. Now, there's two theories or two schools of thought that kind of try to. Einstein's theory of relativity, which takes into account how gravity works and mass and energy's relationship, and that explains a lot of how things work. And then there's the whole school of quantum physics, which I don't understand very much about. I tried to read, and the more I read, the more confused I got on parts of it. But this whole theory of quantum mechanics that looks at the subatomic particles of everything and how they operate and how they're connected and how they move around. But the problem amongst really smart people, that's not a problem for me. I've lived my whole life not worried about it at all. But the problem for really smart people is that those two theories, relativity and quantum mechanics, they don't agree totally with each other. Like they both explain it, how the universe works, but they don't come together, and they'll get different answers kind of at the end when you try to apply both schools of thought to different questions. And there's this belief, Einstein had it, and more famously here recently, Stephen Hawking spent the last big chunk of his life working towards it. There ought to be some mathematical formula that explains it all. A theory of everything. And they believe that that's possible because, again, this universe seems orderly. It seems, even people who would not use the word designed will admit that it seems like there's something that makes it all click together. There's a rhyme and a rhythm, a melody to how everything works, and it would seem like there's one theory that could explain it all. And Paul's almost saying that kind of thing in this passage. Now, Paul's not a scientist. And he's not trying to explain a scientific idea, but this notion in Paul's mind that Jesus explains it all, that's what he's trying to say. And so as we get into it, I kind of want you to have that notion. And I'm not sure that I'll be able to do justice with this. I won't explain it scientifically. I mean, like I said, that gets pretty far beyond my bandwidth and my training. But even theologically, when you try to really think through how that could be, he's saying some pretty deep stuff. And so try to stay with me here. Hopefully I can make some sense of it. But here's the notion. He says in chapter 1, verse 15, the Son is the image of the invisible God. He's firstborn over all creation. And all that means to say, just that first thing there, is that God, Jesus, is what God looks like. If you want to know what God would do in certain situations, watch what Jesus does, and that'll tell you. Jesus explains God. He's the image of the invisible God. God, invisible, is mysterious. Jesus, who is very visible, is not mysterious. And remember that Paul's writing this like 20 or 30 years after Jesus died. It's hard to imagine anybody using that kind of language to describe anybody who's died in the last 50 years. It's hard to imagine us doing that. It's hard to imagine somebody saying that Princess Diana is the image of or that Mother Teresa is the image of, or that whoever, Ronald Reagan or Elvis or who. It's hard to imagine taking some person, no matter how powerful you feel about that person, and using language like this to describe it. And we want to kind of delve into that a little bit. Why were they giving Jesus this much credit? Because they're giving him a ton of credit here when they're saying this. But he's God. That's the notion. That what you see with Jesus, he's God, and he's the firstborn over all creation. Even that notion, I'm a person who, if I can get out into nature, I feel God in that. And probably some of you guys are like that. Probably if I were to talk to a few of you, you would say, oh, yeah, when I'm on top of the mountain, or when I'm on the ocean, or when I'm in the woods, or when I get some quiet moments, the sunset or the sunrise, and I see that, how could you say there's not a God? When I see that, that's what really, and creation, Paul says in a different place, Romans 1:20, is the evidence of the invisible God. People are without excuse. I mean, God has shown himself through creation. And we do feel that. I mean, if you're in the woods, there's a deer that crosses my yard every morning about between 4 and 5 will cross my yard. And it's fun to watch these deer go across my yard and the rhythms of all that, how they're always there at about the same time, how they operate and how they move, and the intelligence and the beauty of it all. You know? It's powerful. But what Paul's saying here in this verse, as great a witness as creation is, Jesus is a better one. If you really want to understand what God's about, Jesus is the touchstone. When you look at Jesus, he's going to explain it all. But he goes further than that. He says, in him, in Jesus, all things were created. Things in heaven, on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, they've all been created through him and for him. He's using language that he uses other places. Paul in Ephesians will talk about thrones and authorities and powers. And there he's talking about devils and demons and those kind of things. Here he's probably talking about something even broader than devils and demons. Just all the different authorities and all the world, they all owe themselves to Jesus. He's still stronger than any of them, which again, just a fantastic thing to say. The early part, he holds it all together, right? That all things in heaven and on earth, it was for him. They've been created through him. They've been created for him. Actually, that holds him together, I think, is the next one. Yeah. He's before all things, and in him all things hold together. Now, you could take that one like literally. That Paul's saying that Jesus at some level holds the atoms together, though he wouldn't have understood what an atom was, but that Jesus at some level holds the subatomic particles together. It's Jesus that holds it, I mean, literally, physically holds it together. That at the beginning of the before creation, it was chaos, and it's Jesus that keeps it together. Without Jesus keeping it together, it goes right back to chaos. You could read it that way. And maybe what he is trying to say, but I suspect he's talking more about how we relate to it and how we connect to it. Jesus is the image of the invisible God. He creates it all. He holds it all together. He's the muscle behind it. But he also shows us our purpose. He shows us where we're headed. He shows us what our lives are about. He makes it all make sense. Yes, he created the world that we stand on, but he created your world. He did, and he's before your world, and he's what's going to empower you to get through your world. Whatever it is, and whatever it is that's knocking you around, that Jesus is behind all those things. There's some people who think that this is an early hymn, that the poetry of it is so pretty that Paul probably couldn't have come up with it, that it was something so beautiful. And I don't know whether that's true or not, but I will concede that it's heavy thought. And it's the kind of thing it's hard to talk about one-on-one with somebody because it is kind of heavy thought. And unless the other person's kind of where you're at, it's hard to totally dig it. But it seems like what he's saying, in the same way that a motherboard would have all sorts of chips in it, and all those chips are doing good work, without the motherboard, nothing happens. And that's God. And you're a part of it whether you know it or not. It's like being a spaceship, and there's all these astronauts on the spaceship, and they're all scientists and military men, but God's controlling it. The same way that those guys in the ship don't even control the air they breathe. It's a gift. It's a gift for us too. It's Jesus that holds it all together. And that's what he is. But he does something too. It says he's the head of the body. He's the head of the church. In the beginning, he's the beginning and the firstborn from amongst the dead, and in everything he might have supremacy. So Jesus isn't just in charge of creation, he's in charge of the new creation. He's in charge of us. And because he's in charge of us, as a church, our agenda has to be, what does God want us to do? What does God hope that we accomplish? It can't be anything else. If our concern starts to be, what would make the most people here happy? We'll get off track. If our concern starts to be, how do we make sure Mount Pleasant stays important, stays prominent, stays visible, we won't do the right thing. I read this week about another church in a different place that scandal has broken out. Some leader in the church has done some awful things, illegal things, and other leaders in the church knew about it. And once they found out about it, they hid it. They said, we can't let this get out. If this gets out, this could ruin our whole church. This could end our church. It's such a big scandal. If the whole town found out about it, everything could go away. And don't you see how how wrong that? I mean, you know it instinctively, right? That's wrong. But as soon as you start thinking that the main thing is making sure the church survives, then you won't do Jesus' stuff first. You'll do your stuff first. But he's the firstborn. In everything, it's got to be about him. I mean, if he wants us to do it, then we have to do it. If he thinks as a church we should be about that, then we have to be about that. You think about, as you're reading your Bible and you're reading the New Testament, you see something that you say, well, wait a minute. So they did this, but we're not doing that. I think you should bring that to the church. Bring that to me. Bring it to one of the leaders. Hey, why aren't we doing this? And sometimes there's a great reason. Well, we think, and you can talk about it. But don't ever let it go, because that has to be what we're about. And we've had conversations at different times in the past about how much money we should save, or how much we should invest in our building, or how much we should invest in making sure, like insurance and those kinds of things. Those are all heavy decisions to think about, and they're hard. But I want to argue here that no one has more to lose than I do if this whole thing goes belly up, right? I mean, I'm the one who draws an income from it. I'm the one who will have to move if the church goes out of business. And yet I'm telling you that has to be our drive. What does Jesus want? And you know, there may be things that Jesus wants in Bedford that are even bigger than Mount Pleasant. We may have to give everything to do some of the things that Jesus wants. And I think we have to be willing to do that. He's firstborn. He's the boss. Everything's about Jesus. And really, if he is before all things and for all things and in all things and holds all things together, then it'll only make sense if we do it that way. It'll only work out if we do it that way. Let me move on. He says, for God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in Jesus, and through Jesus to reconcile himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Jesus contains all the fullness of God, but he's still a man and fully God. All the fullness of God in him, but he still bleeds. And Jesus does for us something that we cannot do for ourselves, right? Jesus lays his life down. He pays for our mistakes. This is the gospel. This is the whole deal. Because of what Jesus did, we have a chance to stand up again. Because of what Jesus did, any one of us can go into God's presence. by ourselves, we're still just dust and ashes. I'm about to be 55 years old, and there's still times in my life when I think about how my life's going, and it's so frustrating that I'm not further along now than I am. There's moments when I'll pray real hard for somebody to get better, and they don't get better, and I find myself wondering, God, are you hearing me? Am I doing this right? And I've been doing this for a long time, right? I mean, surely by now I'd be over that, but I'm just dust and ashes. There's different sin things that can get its hooks into me if I don't watch out. Different temptations to do stupid things that surely by now I wouldn't be tempted by that. And it just takes one little pothole in the road and just wreck my whole day. And how could I be so dumb at this point? But I'm just dust and I'm made of meat. And so the hard part, if it depends on me to get to heaven, I have no hope at all. He's given commands and I'm not obeying them. There's a story in the Old Testament, and it's kind of a funny it's an odd story. They're bringing the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. The Ark of the Covenant, if you're not familiar with that language, it was a box basically, and it was supposed to be carried by poles of guys on both sides carrying on poles, and it would look like one of those Middle Eastern or Southeastern Asian deals where they carry the king, right? And there's the litter in between, and they're carrying the king. And that was the symbol for Israel. This is God's throne. It's an empty chair. That God is the invisible God sits on this box, and so because it was so holy, no one could even touch it. If you touched it, you'd die immediately. And so they're carrying the ark back into Jerusalem, but they're not carrying it on poles. They're not treating God with respect. They got it on a cart. There's ox carrying it. That's probably faster. Probably was easier. That's probably why they did it. And so they're carrying the ark into Israel, and as they come around a corner, as they go around a bend, as they hit a pothole, the ark starts to slip out of the back of the cart there. And there's a guy named Uzzah, and he puts his hand on it to stop it from happening. And as soon as he touches it, he dies. And it makes everybody mad. The king is mad, the people are mad, everybody's mad. They just take the ark and they put it in this guy's barn right there beside the road. Say, we'll keep it here. Who needs it? It's too dangerous. And they leave it there and they walk away. And it takes months and months and months before they really start to understand why it all went wrong. Because the assumption that the dead man made was that I can't let this ark, this precious thing, get in the mud. I can't let this artifact get into the mud. I can't let it get into the dirt. But he didn't understand that he was dirtier than the dirt. Because creation always does what it's told. If God tells the waters to part, they part. If he tells the earth to split, it splits. The earth always does what God tells it to do. The only thing in all creation that won't listen to God is us. God says to us, "Thou shalt not lie." And we say, well, sometimes it's necessary, God. Sometimes I have to. He says to us, "Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery." And we have trouble with some of these rules. Those are hard rules, God. I can give you about 80%, we say, and negotiate with him. The only thing in all creation that has the dirt of sin on it is us. And when he touches that ark, he's assuming that he's clean, and he's not. And I'm not clean, and you're not clean. And if we're going to draw close to a holy God, we're always going to feel the weight of that. And so Jesus comes and does for us what we cannot do. He pays for it. Pays for all the sin you've ever done. Pays for all the sin you're going to do. What's it say behind me there? He made peace through his blood. Whatever conflict you and God have, it has been paid for. And he did it all on the cross. And what an awesome, powerful thing that is. And we should never lose sight of it, because it changes everything. He says, once you were alienated from God, and you were enemies in your minds because of evil behavior, but now you've been reconciled by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. Now catch the grammar of this here. He has reconciled you. That's past tense. So if you're a Christian, you're already reconciled. This is very good news, right? Your family might have argued the whole way to church this morning. might have taken 3 beers just to get you here today. And yet, he says, he has reconciled you. Even if you're a mess, Even if you're a mess, it's been paid for. It's already done. And look at the language here. Holy in his sight, without blemish, free from accusation. And I mean, really, work with me here just for a second and meditate on that. Just for not very long. Just think on this with me. How much did you think about God this week? I mean, for some of you, I'm sure it was a steady mountaintop experience. But I bet for a lot of people, you didn't think about God very much. You just went about your day. If we compare how much time you spent watching television compared to time you spent thinking about God in one way or another, I bet one's a lot heavier than the other, right? And again, it's not true for everybody. I'm not judging. I'm sure there's some in here who were just in a steady state of prayer all week long. But I bet there's a lot of people who, honest to God, didn't think about God at all this week. You were the furthest thing from holy. And yet this is all past tense. He has reconciled you. You've been made holy. You now are without accusation, now without blemish, if, he says, you continue in your faith. Now, you could read this as if he's turning it all around here, right? We just spent 3 or 4 sentences there saying how you're paid. Well, no, you better keep straight. But that's not what he's not what he's doing, because you can't keep straight. We don't have it in us. Now, and while I think that a person could possibly take this notion so far that you would say your behavior doesn't matter at all, and I don't mean that. It's good to be good, but this notion here, if you continue in your faith, establish it firm, and don't move from the hope. That's the issue. I want to continue holding on to Jesus, and it may not always look that good. Sometimes. If you could put a camera in my house, I might not all be happy with all the things you'd see. If you could put a camera in my head and catch my thoughts, I might not always be proud of all the things I think. Sometimes I might look a lot less than heroic and a lot more just lazy and misguided, and yet I don't want to move off of that hope that God can still, if I keep turning back to him, change somebody like me. That I was distracted and lonely and insecure and lost, and he grabbed me. And while I can still be any of those things, I'm not going to lose the hope that Christ will change me if I keep holding on to him. The same God who created everything is still creating. The same God who holds it all together is still moving and will still hold you together if you'll let him. He absolutely will. The same power that he used then, he can use now. And it's not about making you rich. That's where the prosperity gospel gets all off track. It's not about making you rich or good looking or healthy all the time. It's about changing you here. It's about changing you here. It's about making you the kind of person who really is holy. And he can do it if you'll let him move, if you'll let him change. The hope of the gospel is that it depends on Jesus. So as long as I hang on to him, I've got a chance. And Paul says this is what we've been talking about. This is the whole message. Don't let go of Jesus. He's the center of everything. This week I had I didn't do anything, but my 5th grandchild came into the world. All boys. I've got a basketball team. If they've all got that Huddleston genetic structure, they won't be a great basketball team, but that's all right. That's all right. They're good boys. I'm sure they are, and we're going to hope big things for all of them, and it's fun to watch all that. It's fun to be in the middle of it. It's fun to be grandpa. It's fun to do that. But it was kind of a wild week, trying to steal an hour here or there or wherever to get all the things done that I need to get done. And as I was coming back yesterday, I was listening to this podcast. And it kind of changed my thinking here on the end of the sermon, because it was really smart how this guy put it together. I like history anyway. And the guy I was listening to is a guy named Tom Holland, and it's a historian. It's not Spider-Man. It's a historian in England, and it's really smart, the stuff he's talking about. And he's talking about history of that time, and he asks this question in the middle of the podcast: why was Jesus so famous? Why was Jesus so famous? Lots of people were crucified. They didn't become famous. I mean, why was Jesus, what is it? And he said in the podcast, and he's a historian, and it was cool to hear it, because again, he's not a Christian. He'll say he's not a Christian. He said, no serious historian disputes that there was a man named Jesus who lived and died, and that his life went more or less the way the New Testament says it did. I mean, you can debate about the different miracles, or you can debate about different things, but more or less, the story is, no serious historian disputes that happened, which was cool to hear, right? Because again, this guy's not a Christian. He's not saying that so that I'll become a Christian too. He's just saying it's because it's the truth. But he asked the question, but why was he so famous? And when you try to figure out why Jesus was so famous compared to anybody else in ancient history, it's hard to think about, because Jesus was not rich. Some guys who became famous because they were important that way. They were rich. They dominated cities, or they dominated countries. They dominated people's worldviews for years and years and years. And Jesus never did that. In fact, he didn't do anything very long. Every record we have of Jesus says the first 30 years of his life, he really didn't do anything. Kind of in the background. He's just a carpenter. And then for between 1 and 3 years, he explodes onto the scene teaching, and then he's gone. And it wasn't a long. You can see why a guy named Alexander the Great would be famous, because he conquered all this ground, and he was around such a long time and did all these, but you can see why Socrates was famous. He was wealthy, and he was hired by kings, and he lasted a long time. You can see that, but Jesus didn't have money, and Jesus didn't have an army, and Jesus didn't have, he wasn't even that famous in his own country at the time. When you look at other things that were written about Jesus outside of the Bible, there's people who wrote about him, but there's not a lot. It was not compared to other people of the same time period. Why was he so famous? What is it about Jesus that made people interested? What is it about Jesus that made people pay attention? And Tom Holland, who again is not a Christian, says he thinks it was three things. He says, first, you've got to give Jesus credit for the quality teaching that he did. You may not agree with it or believe in it, but it's really smart how Jesus could take complicated concepts and put them in a story that stuck in your head. Like the prodigal son story. A father has two sons, and one decides to go rebel, and he wastes all his money, and he comes back willing to be a slave to the dad. And the dad won't hear it. He hugs him, because my son was lost, now he's found again. And he takes him back in, and Jesus says, God's like that. And that story immediately makes it all make sense. It's just a little story, and I hear the little story, and it all makes sense. Or the Good Samaritan story. A guy's going from town to town. He's robbed, beaten up, left for dead. Other guys just walk past him. But then this guy comes along. He's a Samaritan. He's an enemy of the first man. Normally they would hate each other and yell at each other and call each other names. But when the second man sees the first one all broken down and bloody, he can't help but do something. He feels this pity in him. So he takes him and gets him medical care, and he gets him healed up, says, I'll pay for whatever it is. He really is the right kind of man. He's a good neighbor because he takes care of people when he sees a need. And again, it's just this little story, but it sticks in your head. You can't forget it. Oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. That's what I should do. Or Tom Holland even referred to a story that I think is one of Jesus' best moments. It's such a little stupid thing. It's not even it shouldn't be a big deal, but it's so cool. And he's in an argument with the leaders, the Pharisees, and one of them says, well, hey, should we pay taxes? The Romans want us to pay taxes. What do you think? And they're trying to, put him on the spot. And Jesus says, show me a coin. So they pull one out. Whose image is on it? Caesar. Well, give Caesar what's Caesar's. Give God what's God's. And it's such a smart thing. I could do like 20 sermons on it. It's just such a smart thing to say. I would never be that smart in that moment. Because at once, it's subversive and submissive. And if Caesar heard about that, he can't really be mad, because he's saying give Caesar what's Caesar's. But at the same time, in that little sentence, give Caesar what's Caesar, give God what's God. And he's saying there's more important things than Caesar. There's more important things than coins. Give Caesar whatever he wants. Republican, Democrat, what is it? It's temporary. And don't devote your whole life to these temporary things. It's such a little statement. It sounds so humble. Give Caesar what's Caesar's. How can Caesar be mad? But Caesar would be mad, because he knows what Jesus is really saying. It's just so clever. It's got 20 different layers to it, and it's just something he thinks of off the cuff. And so Tom Holland says, when you think about why Jesus is famous, part of it's that. He's just really a good teacher. I mean, to only teach for a year or so. And Holland in the podcast even kind of laughed about it because the guy he's doing it with says, well, there's some guys who think that Jesus didn't really say all those things, that other people said it. And he says, well, that's crazy. Yeah, I mean, Jesus didn't write any of the books about him. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the books about Jesus. And so people are saying that some committee figured this out. Have you ever been on a committee? It's nuts. I mean, somebody was smart in this. And Tom Holland, who's not a Christian, so I think was Jesus. So that's the first thing, is really good teaching. The second thing is the cross. The second thing is the cross. Jesus, by every account of his life, says, I have to die. He believed in what he was teaching so strongly that he said, I have to die. You know, people won't die for a lie. They won't. Not if they know they're lying, they won't. And Jesus does. That Jesus goes to the very end believing that he's telling the truth. His death proves it, right? His death proves it, his sincerity. He believes to the very end everything he's saying. His death proves it. But it's not just that. It's the things he says about his death. He says that his death is going to be some sort of a sacrifice that will pay for the sins of everyone. He believes, there was a story in Jewish religion that said that when Moses freed the people from Egypt, the night before they left, they killed a lamb, they put the blood of the lamb above the door, and that blood covered the whole house. And so no matter what was going on in that house, they were covered by by the blood of the lamb. And Jesus says, I'm the lamb like that. And they're going to take my blood and they're going to cover their houses and they'll be saved. It's just a crazy, wild thing to say, but he believed it and he died to show that he believed it. And you think again about your house. You know, a lot of you don't live in perfect houses. A lot of you live in houses where people are fighting all the time, or people are rolling their eyes all the time, or people are ignoring one another all the time. Some of you live in houses where there's some dirty secrets that not everybody knows. Some of you live in houses that have been broken and re-put together and broken and re-put together. Some of you live in houses, they're just a mess, chaos from day to night. But if you cover that house with the blood of the Lamb, you have a hope. And that's the gospel which we've been preaching the whole time. And Jesus believed it. And so Holland says it was his teaching, it was the cross, and it was the resurrection. Now, I kind of got the sense from the podcast that Holland doesn't believe the resurrection happened, that he doesn't believe that it happened. I kind of got that sense. But he will acknowledge that something happened. And it was powerful enough that it was like a nuclear bomb going off in Jerusalem. I mean, people suddenly were changing. I mean, within one generation, half of the city is Christian. Within 2 or 3 generations, the whole Roman Empire is infected with this thing. Within a couple hundred years, it's the dominant religion in the Western world. And there's just nothing else in history to compare. The people who took Jesus' message, took his message out because they believed he was God. And it was the resurrection that cinched that. This is kind of a new thinking. Jewish teaching was that God is one, but Christian teaching was that he's one, but he's also more than one, and that Jesus is God. It reminded me of Sam Alberry as a preacher that I like, and he talks about the Trinity in one of his lessons. And he says the Trinity, the way to understand it is who and what. Who and what. Like in fiction, one of my favorite shows is The Office. And so Michael Scott. Well, who is he? He's Michael Scott. What is he? He's a man. Or Chewbacca. You know, right? Who is he? He's Chewbacca. What is he? He's a Wookiee. Or Frodo. Who is he? He's Frodo. What is he? He's a Hobbit. Or Optimus Prime. Who is he? He's Optimus Prime. Well, what is he? Well, that's complicated, right? Because sometimes he's a truck, and sometimes he's a robot. He's both. He's one who and 2 whats. Well, who's God? Well, God is 1 what and 3 whos. It's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Jesus is the image of the invisible God. If you want to know what God's like, it's Jesus. Jesus has laid his life down for you. That's why he's famous. Jesus has come back in a resurrection to prove it. That's why he's famous. Jesus showed you how to live with his teaching and his example, and he showed you how to act by doing what he did, and that's why he's famous. And if you grab a hold of Jesus, you can have the same hope that millions and billions of people have had, this hope of glory. And that's why he's famous, and that's why he came. And Jesus really is the theory of everything. It all is tied to him. He ties it all together. When you come into this place, I don't know what got you here this morning. Maybe you came because what we do on Sunday morning. You didn't even think about it. Maybe you came because you were guilted into coming. You didn't want to, but someone talked you in. Maybe you were invited. Maybe you came today because you haven't been to church for a long time and we need to get back. You know, it's New Year's resolution kind of a thing. But whatever brought you here, it doesn't matter. You're here. And God can use it because he's everything. He holds it all together. And if you'll reach out to Jesus, he can hold you too. And he can make you be who you're supposed to be. One last thing. It's a C.S. Lewis deal. Partly when I was getting into all this physics stuff, I ran across a C.S. Lewis quote, which is always cool to me because I like him quite a bit. Lewis says, in the whole history of the universe, the laws of nature have never produced a single event. They are the patterns to which every event must conform, provided only that it be induced to happen. In the whole history of the universe, the laws of nature have never produced anything. They're like a pool ball. If a guy strikes a pool ball, physics will tell you where the ball will go. But it didn't strike the ball. Somebody had to strike the ball. Somebody had to hit the cue ball. Somebody had to play the game, right? The laws of nature tell you what happens next, but it's not the initial cause. It's not the initial spark. Laws of physics can tell why you came here this morning, maybe. Laws of physics can tell what would normally happen in your house. If somebody were to watch your house, a psychologist or a sociologist or an anthropologist, they could probably guess ahead of time how your day will go. Oh, okay, this person will say this, then they'll say this, and then this will happen next, and then watch, and this, and this, and this. It always happens. Pay attention. And they're watching on video to see how your family will act. We can tell what will happen, but we can't tell the initial, what makes it happen. What comes in behind to whisper in the ear. And Jesus can change everything. So at the end of our service, we want to give you a chance, if you want it, to come and pray. To come and ask Jesus to come into your heart, to come and ask Jesus to lead your life, to take your one and only life and to do something with it. I'm going to have the band come back up. We'll have some guys on both sides to pray. There will be a couple in the back by the doors to pray. Take advantage of this time and lift God up. Ask God to move in your heart of hearts and change. And I'm going to be up here in the front since Danielle's leading. I'll be up here in the front and I'll pray with you too. And we're going to do a couple of songs. And what we might do here for the second song, once we get to that second song, is I might ask you to come and pray, even if you got nothing to pray about. Just come and pray and ask God to move in us. And ask God to shake us up a little bit. Ask us, God, to make our church an agent for his purposes here in this town. I think the world is hungry to see what could happen if somebody really gave themselves whole to God. So let's pray for that today too. Stand up, and I'm going to pray with you. Dear Lord God, I thank you for a chance to come here together. I thank you, God, for this group and for each one of them. And Father, I pray right now that you put your hand on us. And God, if anybody comes up, I just pray you grab them. Like that prodigal son, God, let them know that there's nobody too far away to come back to you. And I pray, Father, especially for the person who's already a pretty good person, who already thinks of themselves as a pretty solid person. They have some sins they're trying to manage, but help them, God, not to quit on the hope that comes from being fully abandoned to you. In Jesus' name, amen.